In 1942, on the overgrown grounds of the Lockwood estate, a mansion was razed to dust, its grand foundations buried and forgotten. Nothing was left but rubble and whispers. 75 years later, a granddaughter came looking for memories and found a staircase no one knew existed, leading down into a ballroom sealed from time itself. Ilara cut the engine of her slightly sputtering sedan, the final notes of a Benny Goodman foxtrot dissolving into silence. The quiet that rushed in to replace it felt heavier than she expected, thick with the hum of insects and the oppressive humidity of a late summer afternoon. She stared through the windshield at what was, by any official record, Lot 7B of the municipal overflow parking grid, a place for cars that didn't fit at the nearby community center. But to her, it was something else entirely. It was the last tangible piece of the Lockwood estate, the place where her grandmother Evelyn's stories had been born. The lot was a disaster, a testament to decades of civic neglect. Weeds, some as tall as she was, choked out everything, their thick thorny stems weaving a hostile tapestry over the uneven ground. A rusted chain-link fence, breached in a dozen places, sagged between concrete posts that were themselves crumbling into grey dust. She pushed the car door open, the hinges groaning in protest. The air smelled of damp earth and decaying leaves, a scent that felt ancient and profound. Her sensible boots sank slightly into the soft soil as she walked toward the center of the rectangular plot, her eyes scanning the ground. Her grandmother had spoken of a grand entrance, of a fountain shaped like a trio of leaping stags, and of rose gardens so vast you could get lost in them. Now there was only a sea of ragweed and a few stubborn, gnarled trees that might have once been ornamental but were now just wild. Ilara ran a hand through her hair, a nervous habit she'd never managed to shake. Fresh out of college with a degree in history that felt more like a passion project than a career path, she had returned home to this small, sleepy town to settle Evelyn's final affairs. It was a task her parents had wanted to hand off to a lawyer, a sterile and efficient process of liquidation. But Ilara had insisted. She needed this connection, this final walk through the ruins of her grandmother's memories. Evelyn had been her link to a past that felt more vibrant and romantic than her own present, a past filled with the swish of ball gowns and the bright brassy notes of the dance music she'd collected on dusty vinyl records. Ilara still had those records, their crackle and pop a familiar comfort. It was that music, the soundtrack to a vanished era, that had drawn her here. She felt a deep, almost painful craving to reconcile the world her grandmother had described with the desolate patch of land before her. She had promised herself she would perform one last duty for Evelyn, to go through the box of papers her grandmother had kept, the one labeled simply Lockwood. Her parents had found it in the back of a closet, a heavy, military green metal box, its surface mottled with rust. They'd dismissed it as more of an anchor than a treasure chest, but Ilara had claimed it immediately. She'd brought it with her, and now she hefted it from the back seat of her car. The box was heavier than it looked, its contents shifting with a soft, papery sigh as she carried it toward a large, flat-topped rock that might have once been part of a foundation wall. She set the box down with a dull thud, the sound startling a pair of crows from a nearby tree. They cawed their disapproval and wheeled away into the hazy sky. For a moment, Ilara felt like an intruder, a grave robber disturbing a long and settled peace. But the feeling passed, replaced by a surge of determination. Her grandmother's stories deserved more than to fade into hearsay. She fiddled with the corroded latch on the filing box. It was stuck fast, sealed by 75 years of damp and disuse. Resourcefulness was a trait she'd inherited from Evelyn, who could supposedly fix a tractor engine with a hairpin and some twine. Ilara rummaged in her car's glove compartment and returned with a tire iron. It took several minutes of careful, frustrating work, her knuckles scraping against the rusted metal, before the latch gave way with a percussive groan that echoed across the silent lot. A puff of dry, musty air escaped, smelling of forgotten paper and time itself. She lifted the heavy lid, her heart pounding a little faster. Inside, the contents were packed tight. The top layer was a collection of yellowed newspaper clippings, their headlines announcing wartime bond drives and local rationing ordinances. Beneath them were bundles of letters tied with faded ribbon, their cursive script elegant and looping. She found tax receipts, property deeds, and a thick stack of invoices for things like 200 yards of French silk and 12 crystal decanters, each a tiny, tantalizing glimpse into a life of vanished opulence. She set these aside carefully, creating neat piles on the rock beside her. The work was slow, methodical. It felt like an archaeological dig, each layer revealing a different stratum of her family's history. Her fingers, now coated in a fine layer of dust, brushed against something hard and rectangular. It was a thick, bound ledger, its leather cover cracked and brittle. She opened it, and the pages were filled with her great-grandfather's precise, angular handwriting, detailing household expenses down to the last penny. A bag of flour, a new set of horseshoes, the salary for a head gardener. It was all so mundane, so domestic. It wasn't the grand romance she had been looking for. A wave of disappointment washed over her. Maybe her parents were right. Maybe it was just a box of old papers, its significance inflated by a grieving granddaughter's imagination. She was about to close the ledger when a small, folded piece of paper slipped out from between the back pages. It was different from the others, not a receipt or a letter, but a stiff, card-like document. She unfolded it carefully, her brow furrowing in concentration. It was a demolition permit, issued by the county in the spring of 1942. Her eyes scanned the technical jargon, the neat columns and official stamps. The permit authorized the raising of the Lockwood Mansion, a structure described as 3 stories, wood and stone construction, with associated outbuildings. It was the official death certificate of her grandmother's world. She felt a lump form in her throat as she read the name of the contractor, the specified dates, the cold bureaucratic language that had undone so much beauty. Then she saw it. Tucked away in a section outlining the scope of the work was a checklist for various structural elements. Foundation to be broken up, it read. All surface-level structures to be cleared. She read the list again, a strange feeling of unease prickling at the back of her neck. It was a standard demolition order, comprehensive and final. But it was what the permit didn't say that held her attention. There was a line for sub-level structures, basements, cellars. The box next to it was checked NA. According to this official document, the sprawling Lockwood estate had been built without a single basement level. That couldn't be right. Her grandmother's stories were filled with descriptions of the wine cellar, the cold storage rooms, the deep, cool places beneath the house. Had Evelyn invented all of it, or was the official record wrong? The question hung in the humid air, a mystery taking its first breath. The single, unambiguous abbreviation stared up at her from the faded page. Nene, not applicable. Elara traced the letters with her finger, the rough texture of the old paper a stark contrast to the smooth, cold denial the letters represented. It felt wrong, fundamentally wrong. A house of that size, a Victorian mansion built in an era of elaborate, over-engineered construction, would have certainly required a deep and substantial foundation, and almost invariably a cellar. It was a practical necessity for everything from storing coal for the furnace to keeping perishable foods cool in the summer months. To suggest a structure like the Lockwood estate had been built like a simple cottage, flat on the earth, defied architectural logic. It was a detail so glaringly incorrect that it couldn't be a simple mistake. It felt deliberate. She sat back on her heels, the weight of the filing box lid pressing into her knees. The sun beat down on her, and sweat trickled down her temples. The drone of the cicadas seemed to grow louder, a monotonous, pulsing sound that grated on her nerves. She had come here seeking connection, a bridge to her grandmother's past. Instead, she had found a contradiction, a chasm between memory and record. Her mind raced, sifting through the dozens of stories Evelyn had told her over the years. Stories of sneaking down to the wine cellar with her brother to steal a sip of sacramental wine, their laughter echoing in the cool, stone-lined corridors. Stories of the massive furnace in the sub-basement, a monstrous iron beast that her great-grandfather called the Dragon, and which the staff fed with shovelfuls of coal. Were these all fabrications? The idle fantasies of an old woman romanticizing her youth? It didn't feel right. Evelyn had been many things, witty, charming, sometimes prone to exaggeration, but she had never been a liar. Her memories had been too specific, filled with sensory details that were impossible to invent. She had described the precise smell of the damp earth in the root cellar, the way the light from a single bare bulb would glint off the dusty bottles in the wine racks, the constant low hum of the boiler that you could feel in the soles of your feet even on the ground floor. Elara could almost hear her grandmother's voice now, light and musical, painting a picture of a world that this official document claimed had never existed. Driven by a new and urgent need for clarity, Elara turned back to the filing box. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the overgrown lot. She had to be methodical. If the demolition permit was a lie, then there had to be other documents, other clues, that could either corroborate it or expose it. Her hands moved with a renewed sense of purpose, no longer just sifting through keepsakes but actively hunting for evidence. She bypassed the personal letters and the sentimental clippings, her eyes scanning for anything that looked official, anything related to the construction or maintenance of the house itself. She pulled out a thick folder labeled Property Upkeep, 1920. Inside was a cascade of receipts and work orders, a bill for repairing a slate roof after a winter storm, an invoice for the delivery of 10 tons of anthracite coal that would have needed to be stored somewhere large and subterranean, a work order for a plumber to address a leak in the laundry room pipes, cellar level. The words leaped out at her. Cellar level. Her heart gave a sharp, triumphant thud against her ribs. It was there in black and white, in the plumber's looping, practical script. It was the first piece of concrete evidence that contradicted the demolition permit. It was proof that her grandmother's memories were not fantasies. The cellar was real. A new question immediately took shape in her mind, sharp and insistent. If the cellar was real, why would the official demolition record explicitly deny its existence? It made no sense. Demolishing a basement was a more complex and costly undertaking than clearing a surface-level structure. It involved extensive excavation, backfilling, and ensuring the stability of the surrounding ground. To omit it from the permit wasn't just an oversight, it was a significant misrepresentation of the job, one that could have serious legal and financial ramifications. Why would the contractor, a reputable local firm according to the letterhead, sign off on a document that was so demonstrably false? And why would the county inspector have approved it? Elara felt a chill creep over her, despite the humid air. This was no longer a simple matter of settling an estate or indulging in a bit of family nostalgia. A simple contradiction had morphed into a conspiracy. Someone, for some reason, had gone to great lengths to officially erase the existence of the mansion's lower levels. It was an act of deliberate historical vandalism, a lie set in stone in the county records. The motive was a complete mystery, a gaping hole in the narrative she was trying to piece together. Who would benefit from such a deception? What could possibly have been in that basement that someone wanted to ensure was not only destroyed but forgotten, wiped from the official memory of the town? She carefully placed the plumber's work order next to the demolition permit on the rock, the two documents forming a tableau of contradiction. One was an unassuming piece of paper, a record of a minor household repair. The other was a powerful legal instrument, the final word on the fate of the Lockwood estate, and one of them was lying. Her college history professors had taught her to always question the official record, to understand that history is often written by the victors, or in this case by those who held the pen and the stamp. The demolition permit was the official history, but the plumber's bill, the coal delivery invoice, her grandmother's unwavering stories, that was the hidden history, the one she now felt a burning obligation to unearth. The light was fading fast, the sky turning a deep bruised purple. The air grew cooler, and the scent of damp earth intensified. Elara knew she should pack up and leave, that sitting alone in this desolate lot as darkness fell was probably unwise. But she felt rooted to the spot, a detective who had just been handed the first critical clue in a 75-year-old cold case. The overgrown lot no longer felt merely neglected. It felt secretive. The weeds and rubble weren't just the result of time and nature reclaiming the land. They were a cover-up, a dense living blanket thrown over a secret that had been buried here 3/4 of a century ago. She stared out at the uneven ground, her eyes trying to pierce the gloom. Somewhere beneath her feet, beneath the tangled roots and the compacted soil, lay the answer. The thought sent a fresh wave of determination through her, extinguishing any lingering fear. She wasn't leaving, not yet. The last sliver of the sun vanished below the horizon, and the world bled into shades of gray and deep blue. Elara switched on the flashlight on her phone, its cold white beam cutting a sharp circle into the encroaching darkness. The sudden artificial light made the overgrown lot feel even more alien and mysterious, the dancing shadows of the weeds looking like grasping fingers. She knew she was being irrational, that her imagination was being stoked by the day's discoveries, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was the weight of the past, she told herself, the silent testament of the lives that had been lived and lost on this very ground. She took a deep breath, the cool night air steadying her nerves, and turned her attention back to the green metal box, determined to see if it held any more secrets before she called it a night. Most of the remaining contents were personal effects. A lock of baby hair tied with a blue ribbon, a silver locket tarnished with age that wouldn't open, a small velvet-lined box containing a pair of mother-of-pearl cufflinks. These were the intimate, sentimental treasures that Evelyn had saved, the small anchors of a life. Elara handled them with reverence, each object a direct physical link to the grandparents and great-grandparents she had only ever known through stories and faded portraits. The tenderness of these items felt at odds with the cold, bureaucratic mystery of the demolition permit. It was a reminder that this wasn't just an intellectual puzzle, it was her family's story, full of love and loss and secrets she was only just beginning to comprehend. Her fingers brushed against the smooth, cool surface of a metal tin at the bottom of the box. It wasn't another document file, but a biscuit tin, its painted lid showing a cheerful, anachronistic scene of a Scottish terrier wearing a tartan bow. It was exactly the kind of whimsical, slightly kitschy thing her grandmother would have used to store something she deemed important. It was lighter than she expected, and when she shook it gently, it made a soft, sliding sound. With a sense of anticipation, she pried off the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of yellowed tissue paper, was a single, thick, sepia-toned photograph mounted on heavy cardstock. She lifted it out carefully, angling it into the beam of her flashlight. The photograph was a formal portrait of a group of people, perhaps 30 or 40 of them, dressed in the height of late 1930s fashion. The men were in sharp tuxedos with slicked-back hair, the women in elegant floor-length gowns of satin and silk, their hair styled in intricate waves. They were all smiling, caught in a moment of candid joy, some holding cocktail glasses, others with their arms linked. In the foreground, a couple was mid-twirl, the woman's dress a blur of motion. It was a party, a moment of glittering, carefree opulence captured just a few years before the world. And this house would be torn apart by war and demolition. Ilara's eyes scanned the faces, searching for familiar features. She recognized her great-grandfather, looking imposing and proud even in a candid moment. And there, near the center, was her grandmother Evelyn, impossibly young and vibrant, her head thrown back in laughter. Seeing her like this, so full of life, sent a pang of grief and affection through Ilara. This was the woman from the stories, the belle of the ball, the heart of the home. This photograph was proof of the life that had thrived here, a life of music and laughter and community. It was a direct visual refutation of the desolation that surrounded her. She was so captivated by the people in the photograph that it took her a full minute to start processing their surroundings. They were indoors, in what was clearly a large, ornate hall. A massive crystal chandelier, only partially in frame, hung from a high ceiling. The walls were adorned with what looked like gilded sconces, their lights casting a warm, inviting glow, but it was the floor that made her breath catch in her throat. The dancers were on a floor made of vast, polished tiles of black and white marble, laid out in a stunning geometric diamond pattern. It was a floor built for dancing, a floor of breathtaking expense and artistry, a floor that simply could not have existed. Her mind immediately flashed back to the demolition permit. 3 stories, wood and stone construction, and to the ledger of household expenses which detailed the purchase of oak parquet for the main hall and imported wool carpets for the sitting rooms. There was no mention anywhere of a marble ballroom. More importantly, a floor of that weight, made of solid stone tiles, would have required an incredibly strong, specially reinforced subfloor. It was the kind of feature you would build in a basement or a dedicated subterranean level, where the earth itself could help support the immense weight. It was not something you would ever find on the ground or upper floors of a traditional Victorian wood frame house. The entire structure would have collapsed. Ilara's hand trembled slightly as she held the photograph. This was it. This was the irrefutable visual proof. The party, the dancing, the laughter, it was all taking place in a room that, according to all official logic and the available documents, did not exist. The room was subterranean. It had to be. This photograph wasn't just a picture of a party. It was a picture of the place her grandmother had remembered and the demolition permit had denied. The secret wasn't just a cellar for storing coal and wine. It was this, a grand hidden ballroom, a place of secret splendor buried beneath the earth. The implications of the discovery were staggering. Why build such a magnificent room only to hide it, and then to go to such lengths to erase it from the public record? A room like this would have been the talk of the town, a feature of immense pride for the Lockwood family. To conceal it suggested a motive far more complex than simple privacy. Was it built for a secret society, a place for clandestine meetings or forbidden activities? The idea felt like something out of a novel, too sensational for this quiet corner of the world. And yet the evidence in her hand was undeniable. The joyful faces in the photograph suddenly looked different to her. Their smiles seemed charged with a shared secret, their laughter echoing in a place no one was ever meant to know existed. She used her phone to take a high-resolution picture of the photograph, zooming in on the details. The clarity of the image was startling. She could make out the intricate scrollwork on the brass railings of a staircase descending into the room from a corner just behind her grandmother. A staircase, a hidden staircase, leading down to a hidden ballroom. The pieces were clicking into place, forming a picture that was both thrilling and deeply unsettling. The overgrown lot, the lying permit, the forgotten photograph, it was all part of a single sprawling mystery. Her initial quest for a sentimental connection to her grandmother had become something far more urgent. She was no longer just piecing together memories. She was uncovering a conspiracy, and she had the feeling that the photograph in her hand was the key to unlocking it all. The night was no longer menacing, it was electric with possibility. The next morning, the fluorescent lights of the County Historical Society felt sterile and unwelcoming after the raw, earthy mystery of the lot. The building smelled of old paper and lemon polish, a scent Alara usually found comforting but which today felt cloying and stagnant. She sat at a heavy oak table, the faded photograph and the contradictory documents laid out before her like evidence in a courtroom. Across from her sat Mr. Arthur Abernathy, the Society's director and the town's unofficial memory keeper. He was a man who seemed to have been curated by time itself, with a tweed jacket that had soft worn patches at the elbows and a pair of spectacles perched precariously on the end of his nose. His eyes, however, were sharp and missed nothing. She had called him first thing in the morning, her voice more breathless with excitement than she'd intended. She explained who she was, the granddaughter of Evelyn Lockwood, and that she had found some confusing family documents she hoped he could help her decipher. He had been gracious on the phone, inviting her to come in immediately, his tone one of gentle, scholarly curiosity. Now in person he leaned forward, his gaze moving deliberately from the demolition permit to the plumber's bill and finally to the sepia-toned photograph. He picked up the photo with a surprising delicacy, his long, thin fingers holding it by the edges. He studied it for a long time, his expression unreadable. "The Lockwood estate," he murmured, his voice a dry rustle like turning pages. "A great loss to the town. They say the house was a masterpiece of its time, though perhaps a bit ostentatious for some tastes." He spoke with the detached air of a historian, reciting facts from a textbook. Demolished in '42, of course. The family had fallen on hard times after the market crash, and the war effort needed the scrap metal. The lot was donated to the town for civic use. He placed the photograph back on the table with the same care he had picked it up with. His eyes, however, did not meet hers. They remained fixed on the image of the laughing dancers. "That's the official story," Alara said, her voice steady. "But I think there's more to it." She tapped the demolition permit. "This document states there was no basement, no sublevels of any kind." Then she pushed the plumber's bill forward. "This work order from 1938 explicitly mentions a cellar level." She saved her most dramatic piece of evidence for last, pointing to the marble floor in the photograph. "And this room, a floor like that would have required a subterranean foundation. This party is taking place in a room that this permit says doesn't exist." She finished, her heart pounding with the force of her conviction. She had expected him to share her excitement, to see the thrilling historical puzzle she was presenting. Instead, a strange stillness fell over Mr. Abernathy. The air of gentle scholarship evaporated, replaced by something guarded and tense. He took off his spectacles and began polishing them with a handkerchief, a slow, deliberate gesture that seemed designed to buy him time. He did not look at the documents again. He looked at Alara, and for the first time she felt like he was truly seeing her, not as the granddaughter of a prominent family, but as a problem. "Miss Lockwood," he began, his voice losing its dry, academic tone and taking on a new, paternalistic weight. "History is a complex thing. It is often a tapestry of conflicting accounts, of memories warped by time, of records that are incomplete or, at times, incorrect. But this is more than an incorrect record," Alara insisted, her frustration mounting. "This is a direct contradiction, a lie. Someone deliberately erased a part of my family's home from the official record. I want to know why." Mr. Abernathy sighed, a long, weary sound. He put his glasses back on and pushed the documents gently back toward her side of the table, a clear gesture of dismissal. "Let me offer you some advice. As someone who has spent a lifetime sifting through the past," he said, his voice low and confidential. "Some things, once buried, are best left that way. The past is not a peaceful place. Digging it up often does more harm than good." The warning was so direct, so unambiguous, that it took Alara by surprise. It wasn't the reaction of a curious historian. It was the reaction of a man issuing a threat, however politely it was veiled. "Harm to whom?" she asked, her voice sharp. "It's my family's history. The truth belongs to them, to me." Mr. Abernathy's eyes hardened slightly. "You are thinking of this as a matter of pride, of restoring some lost glory, but you don't know what you're looking for. You don't know what you might find, or whose memory you might tarnish in the process." His words were heavy with insinuation, hinting at dark secrets and scandals that she couldn't begin to imagine. It was a classic tactic of deflection, to suggest the secret was something shameful, something that would hurt her to uncover. She felt a surge of anger, hot and clarifying. "Are you telling me you know what this secret is?" she challenged. He held her gaze for a moment, a flicker of something. Was it guilt, fear in his eyes? Then he looked away, his composure returning. "I am telling you that the official record is the one that has stood for 75 years, he said, his voice once again cool and distant. "The Lockwood name is respected in this town. Your grandmother was a beloved figure. Why would you want to risk changing that by digging up old rumors and unsettling forgotten ground?" He stood up, a clear signal that the meeting was over. "It was a pleasure to meet you, Miss Lockwood. I wish you the best in settling your grandmother's estate." Elara sat stunned for a moment as he retreated into the stacks, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The encounter had left her reeling. He hadn't just dismissed her, he had actively warned her away. His resistance was more damning than any confirmation could have been. He knew something. He knew what the secret was, and he was afraid of her discovering it. The vague paternalistic warnings about tarnishing memories and letting the past lie were not for her benefit, they were for his. He was protecting the secret, not her family's legacy. The question was, why? What was his connection to the Lockwood estate, to the demolition, to the lie that had been set in paper 75 years ago? She gathered her documents, her hands moving with a new, steely resolve. The old historian's fear had become her fuel. He had intended to scare her off, to make her doubt her quest. Instead, he had done the opposite. He had confirmed that the secret was real, that it was important, and that it was being actively protected. His resistance was the final piece of proof she needed. She walked out of the historical society and into the bright sunlight, her mind racing. The mystery was no longer just about a hidden room. It was about a hidden history, a conspiracy of silence that had lasted for generations. And Mr. Abernathy, the town's trusted keeper of memories, was standing guard at the gate. She now knew that unearthing the ballroom meant defying him, and whatever secrets he was so desperate to keep buried. The challenge, instead of daunting her, felt invigorating. She was closer than ever, and she would not be turned away. The encounter with Mr. Abernathy left a bitter taste in Elara's mouth. His veiled threats echoed in her mind, a dissonant chord in the symphony of her investigation. He hadn't just been unhelpful, he had been obstructive, a gatekeeper to a past he clearly wanted to remain sealed. His fear was a puzzle piece that didn't fit, or rather it suggested the puzzle was far larger and more intricate than she had imagined. Shaken but more determined than ever, she retreated to the one place that felt like a sanctuary, her grandmother's small, quiet house, where she was staying while she settled the estate. The house itself was modest, a far cry from the grandeur of the lost mansion, but it was filled with Evelyn's presence in the worn floral armchair, the collection of porcelain birds on the mantelpiece, and the lingering scent of lavender and old books. She needed to regroup, to find another way in, a key that Abernathy couldn't control. The filing box had given her the initial clues, but it was a finite resource. She had to believe that there was something else, some other scrap of memory or artifact that her grandmother had preserved. Her mind turned to the larger items that had been moved to a professional, climate-controlled storage unit after Evelyn's passing. Her parents had organized it, labeling everything with sterile efficiency. Most of it was furniture, boxes of kitchenware, and clothing destined for donation. But Elara remembered her father mentioning a few pieces that were deemed too valuable or sentimental to part with, including some of the original artwork and portraits from the old estate. A new surge of energy propelled her. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot she had. An hour later, she was standing in the cold, echoing hallway of the storage facility, the stark fluorescent lights humming overhead. She unlocked the heavy metal door to Unit 217, and the past rolled out to greet her. The air was dry and still, smelling faintly of cedar and mothballs. The space was neatly packed, a testament to her father's methodical nature. Stacks of boxes were labeled linens, silverware, books. Against the far wall, shrouded in white dust covers, were several large rectangular shapes, the portraits. She made her way towards them, her footsteps unnaturally loud in the silence. She pulled the cover off the first one. It was a landscape painting, a pastoral scene of rolling hills that was pleasant but unremarkable. The second was a portrait of a stern-faced ancestor she didn't recognize. Then she uncovered the third, and her breath caught. It was them, her great-grandparents, William and Alistair Lockwood, painted in the prime of their lives. He stood tall and confident, his hand resting on the back of a large, ornate chair. She was seated, a book in her lap, her expression one of gentle intelligence. It was a beautiful painting, a masterpiece of portraiture that captured not just their likenesses but their personalities. It was the centerpiece of the main hall in all of her grandmother's stories. Ilara ran her hand over the heavy gilded frame, her thoughts drifting. This portrait had witnessed the life of the house. It had seen the parties, heard the laughter, and watched in silence as the family's fortunes rose and fell. It had been one of the last things removed before the demolition crews arrived. It was a silent witness. As she stared at the painted faces of her ancestors, an idea began to form, a wild, improbable hunch born of desperation. Abernathy had warned her about tarnishing memories. He had tried to make the secret sound shameful. What if the secret wasn't in a document, but hidden with the family itself? What if they had concealed the proof themselves? On impulse, she turned the heavy portrait around. It was a laborious task, the frame digging into her hands. The back of the canvas was covered by a thick brown paper backing, tacked down to the wooden stretcher bars. It looked old, brittle, and perfectly intact. But as she ran her fingers along the bottom edge, she felt it, a slight looseness, a section where the paper had pulled away from the tacks, creating a small, almost imperceptible gap. Her heart began to pound. It was probably nothing, just the effect of age and changing humidity, but she had to know. Using a key from her pocket as a makeshift tool, she carefully worked at the edges of the backing paper. It was delicate work, the paper flaking away under the slightest pressure. She didn't want to damage the painting, but her curiosity was a physical force driving her on. After several minutes of painstaking effort, she managed to pry up a corner of the backing. She peered into the dark space between the paper and the canvas stretcher. At first, she saw nothing but the rough, woven texture of the canvas back. Then, her eyes adjusted to the dim light. There was something else in there, a thin, tightly rolled cylinder of paper, tucked away into the corner of the frame. It looked like a scroll. Her hands trembled as she reached into the narrow gap. Her fingers brushed against the object. It was cool and smooth, its paper of a much higher quality than the brittle backing. She gently worked it out of its hiding place, her movements slow and deliberate, as if handling a sacred relic. She held it in her palm for a moment, a simple roll of paper that felt heavier than its physical weight. This was it. She knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that this was the secret. This was what her great-grandparents had hidden before they lost their home, a message in a bottle set adrift in time. She carried it over to a clear patch of floor and knelt down, the cold concrete seeping through her jeans. With infinite care, she began to unroll it. The paper was stiff, resisting at first, but then it unfurled with a soft crackle. It was not a letter or a diary. It was a blueprint, a large, incredibly detailed architectural drawing, rendered in precise, confident blue ink. The title block in the bottom right corner was written in elegant architectural script. Lockwood Estate Edition. It read, Subterranean Assembly Hall, commissioned by Mr. William Lockwood, architect Julian Dubois, dated October 1934. Ilara's eyes scanned the drawing, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. It was all there, a masterfully designed, two-story subterranean structure. The main level, labeled Ballroom, showed the exact black and white diamond-patterned marble floor from the photograph. It detailed the dimensions of the room, 100 feet long by 60 feet wide, with a soaring 30-foot ceiling supported by massive reinforced concrete pillars, cleverly disguised within decorative marble columns. It showed the location of the crystal chandelier, the gilded wall sconces, and a raised stage for an orchestra at the far end. And on the right side of the drawing, there it was, plain as day, a hidden curved staircase, exactly where she had glimpsed it in the photograph, connecting the ballroom to a small unmarked room on the ground floor of the main house. This was the first major twist, the undeniable architect-certified truth. The ballroom was not just real, it was an architectural marvel, built in secret just a few years before the house was destroyed. But there was more. A second, smaller sheet of paper was tucked inside the rolled blueprint. She unrolled it. It was a cross-section diagram, showing a lower level beneath the ballroom floor. This level was labeled Access Tunnels and Mechanical, and it showed a network of small corridors, a large space for the boiler and furnace, the very dragon her grandmother had described, and most chillingly, a large reinforced chamber at the far end labeled simply Vault. A vault, a secret, subterranean vault, accessible only through a hidden ballroom. The conspiracy of silence surrounding the demolition suddenly snapped into sharp, terrifying focus. They weren't just hiding a party room, they were hiding this. The reason for the secrecy, the reason for the lies in the official records, had nothing to do with shame or scandal. It had to do with whatever was, or had been, inside that vault. The discovery of the blueprint changed everything. It was no longer a question of if the ballroom existed, but of how to reach it. The faded blue ink on the architectural drawing was a map, a guide to a lost world, and Alara felt its pull like a magnetic force. The weight of the secret now rested on her shoulders, a legacy passed down not through words, but through this hidden, intricate drawing. The initial thrill of discovery quickly gave way to the daunting reality of the task ahead. The ballroom was buried under 75 years of compacted earth, demolition rubble, and a stubborn forest of weeds. Finding it would require more than just historical documents. It would require shovels, muscle, and an unwavering belief in what lay beneath. She couldn't do it alone. The first person she called was her brother, Liam. He was older by 5 years, a pragmatist who worked as a civil engineer. Where Alara was fueled by history and intuition, Liam was grounded in physics and logistics. He was the anchor to her kite, and right now, she needed an anchor. She met him at a diner, the blueprint spread carefully between them on the table, its edges weighted down with salt and pepper shakers. She told him everything, from the filing box and the contradictory permits to the photograph and the cryptic warnings from Mr. Abernathy. Liam listened patiently, his expression shifting from skepticism to intrigue as she laid out the evidence, culminating in the blueprint itself. He studied the drawing with a professional's eye, his fingers tracing the lines of the support columns and the dimensions of the vault. "This is incredible, Ellie," he said, his voice a low whisper of awe. The load calculations alone for a structure like this, built in the 30s, it's a work of art, and to keep it a secret is just insane. He looked up at her, a slow grin spreading across his face. The pragmatist was gone, replaced by the adventurous older brother she'd grown up with. "So," he said, leaning forward, "when do we start digging?" That was all she needed. His belief, his practical expertise, his willingness to join her on this mad quest. They spent the next hour poring over the blueprint, cross-referencing it with a satellite image of the lot on Liam's phone. The blueprint was a ghost, a specter of a building they had to superimpose onto the real world. The architect, Julien Dubois, had included precise measurements from the main house's original foundation lines. The key was the hidden staircase. It was shown descending from what had been a small conservatory on the east side of the mansion. If they could locate the remains of that conservatory's foundation, they could pinpoint the exact location of the sealed stairwell. They spent the rest of the day gathering supplies, heavy-duty shovels, pickaxes, work gloves, powerful LED lanterns, and a long, sturdy rope. It felt like preparing for a great expedition, a journey into the unknown that lay just a few feet beneath the surface of their quiet town. They decided to work under the cover of darkness, not out of a desire for secrecy in the way their great-grandparents had, but to avoid the inevitable questions and potential interference from neighbors or town officials. This was their family's secret to unearth, on their own terms. That night, they returned to the lot. The air was cool and thick with the scent of dew-soaked grass. The moon was a slender crescent providing little light, which suited their purpose perfectly. Guided by Liam's phone and the ghost of the blueprint, they found the area where the conservatory should have been. It was a section of the lot even more overgrown than the rest, a thicket of thorny bushes and young, spindly trees. The work was brutal. They took turns with the pickaxe, breaking up the dense, root-choked soil, while the other cleared the loosened earth with a shovel. Sweat soaked through their clothes within minutes, their muscles burning with the unfamiliar strain. The ground was stubborn, fighting them for every inch. For hours, they dug. The only sounds the rhythmic scrape of their shovels and their own ragged breaths. The pile of excavated earth grew into a small mountain beside them. They found fragments of old terracotta pots, shards of thick wavy glass from the conservatory panes, and the rusted metal frame of a planting table. Each discovery was a small victory, proof that they were in the right place. But as the hours wore on and they dug deeper, a seed of doubt began to sprout in Alara's mind. They were now 4 feet down, standing in a wide, muddy pit, and there was still no sign of a foundation, let alone a sealed staircase. What if the demolition crew had been more thorough than they'd imagined? What if the entrance had been completely obliterated, smashed into unrecognizable rubble and buried forever? Liam, ever the engineer, remained optimistic. Demolition crews in the 40s, especially on a job where they were cutting corners, they'd break up the surface and backfill, he reasoned, pausing to wipe his brow with the back of a muddy glove. They wouldn't waste time and money pulverizing every last stone. They'd just cover it up. We have to be close. His confidence was infectious, and Alara picked up her shovel again. Her resolve hardened. They decided to clear a wider area, expanding the pit laterally. And then, it happened. Liam's shovel struck something with a loud, jarring clang that was not the dull thud of earth or the crack of a random rock. It was a solid, resonant sound, the sound of metal hitting dressed stone. They both froze, their eyes meeting in the beams of their lanterns. A frantic, almost feverish energy seized them. They abandoned the wider clearing and focused on the point of impact, digging with a newfound urgency. The soil gave way to smaller, looser pieces of rubble, broken bricks and chunks of plaster, and then beneath the debris, a clean, straight edge emerged from the dirt. It was the top of a large, perfectly cut block of granite. They cleared more earth around it, and another block appeared, and another. They had found it, the top of the stone casement for the hidden stairwell. It was exactly where the blueprint said it would be. A wave of triumph so powerful it was almost dizzying washed over Alara. She laughed, a giddy, breathless sound that echoed in the quiet night. They had done it. They had found the door to the lost world. The top of the stairwell was sealed, not with a door, but with a massive single slab of concrete, roughly poured and uneven, a clear sign of a hasty cover-up. It was the final crude seal placed upon the elegant secret below. Liam examined it, knocking on the surface. "It's thick," he said, his voice filled with a new level of respect for the conspiracy. They really didn't want anyone finding this. But as he ran his lantern beam along the edges of the slab, he found what they were hoping for, a crack, a fissure running along one side where the concrete hadn't properly bonded with the granite casement below. It was an opening, a weakness in the seal. The past was locked away, but they had just found the keyhole. The crude concrete slab was an insult to the craftsmanship of the granite stairwell it covered. It was the final ugly scar left by the demolition crew, a brutish full stop at the end of a poetic sentence. But the fissure Liam had found was a glimmer of hope, a flaw in the cover-up. It was too small to see through, but it was a starting point, a place to apply force. They spent another hour working at the crack with the pickaxe and a crowbar from Alara's car, their movements now precise and calculated. The work was slow and exhausting. Chips of concrete flew, and with every strike of the pickaxe, a deep, resonant boom echoed into the earth below, as if they were knocking on the door of a tomb. Finally, with a great, groaning crack, a large triangular section of the concrete broke free. It tumbled into the darkness of the stairwell below with a deafening crash that cascaded into a series of smaller, echoing rattles. A plume of dust, thick and ancient, billowed out of the opening, carrying with it a scent that stopped them both in their tracks. It was not the smell of damp earth or simple decay. It was the smell of a place that had been sealed for an eternity, stale, bone-dry air with faint, ghostly undertones of something else, something that might have once been perfume or beeswax polish or champagne. It was the preserved breath of the last party, trapped for 75 years and now finally released. Alara felt a shiver run down her spine that had nothing to do with the cool night air. She peered into the hole they had created, her lantern beam cutting through the swirling dust. The darkness below was absolute, a perfect velvet black that seemed to swallow the light. The blueprint had shown a curved staircase, but from this angle all she could see was a void. Liam, ever practical, took the rope they had brought and securely tied it to the thick root of a nearby tree. He tossed the other end down into the hole. It disappeared without a sound, a testament to the depth they had yet to comprehend. "I'll go first," he said, his voice steady, though Alara could see the excitement glittering in his eyes. "I'll check the structural integrity of the stairs. You wait for my signal." She watched, her heart in her throat, as her brother, the engineer, clipped a powerful lantern to his belt and carefully lowered himself into the opening. His feet found the first step, and he paused. "Stone feels solid," he called up, his voice already sounding distant and hollowed by the enclosed space. No obvious cracks. He descended slowly, step by step, his light shrinking until it was just a small bobbing circle in the immense darkness. Alara waited in silence, straining to hear any sound over the chirping of the crickets. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Then his voice floated up, faint but clear. "Ellie, you are not going to believe this. It's safe. Come on down, but be careful." Taking a deep breath, Alara followed him. The stone steps were wider than she had expected, and covered in a thick, fine layer of dust that felt like silt under her boots. The air grew cooler and more still with every step she took, the sounds of the outside world fading away completely. It was like descending into another world, a place outside of time. The curved walls of the stairwell were smooth, polished stone, cool to the touch. And then she saw what had made Liam gasp, the railing. It was not the simple iron or wood she might have expected. It was a magnificent sweeping balustrade of polished brass, its surface so untarnished by the years that it gleamed a deep, rich gold in the beams of their lights. Its intricate design was a masterpiece of Art Nouveau style, with flowing organic shapes that mimicked vines and flowers. It was a work of art, hidden away in this secret passage. As they descended further, their lights began to reveal more than just the staircase. The demolition crew had clearly used the top of the stairwell as a dumping ground for debris before they sealed it, but they had been lazy, only tossing in what was nearby. Leaning against the curved wall was a tall, slender object that Alara at first mistook for a petrified tree trunk. As she brushed away the dust, she saw that it was a piece of a fluted column, carved from a single piece of white marble, its surface streaked with delicate gray veins. It was cracked clean in half, a victim of the destruction above, but it was still a thing of profound beauty. It was a piece of the ballroom, a fragment of the lost world they were about to enter. A few steps further down, they found more. A gilded wall sconce, its brass arm twisted and bent, but the frosted glass shade still miraculously intact. Shards of what looked like a massive ornate mirror, their silvered backing peeling with age. And everywhere, there were smaller pieces of decorative plasterwork, intricate moldings of leaves and cherubs, all broken and discarded, a jigsaw puzzle of shattered elegance. It was a graveyard of artistry, each piece a testament to the grandeur that had been so violently erased. Alara picked up a fragment of a plaster rose, its petals still perfect and delicate. She imagined it whole, part of a magnificent ceiling cornice, looking down on the dancers in the photograph. The sense of loss was sharp and painful. This wasn't just a discovery, it was a reclamation. They reached the bottom of the staircase, a wide landing that opened up into the vast, cavernous darkness of the ballroom itself. The floor was inches deep in the same fine gray dust, which puffed up in clouds around their boots. Their lantern beams sliced through the blackness, but they were not powerful enough to reach the far walls or the ceiling. The space was immense, far larger than it had felt in the blueprint. It was like standing on the shore of a dark, silent ocean. The air was perfectly still, the silence so profound that Alara could hear the blood rushing in her ears. For a moment they just stood there, two small figures in a vast, forgotten cathedral of silence, overwhelmed by the scale of what they had found. Liam swept his light in a wide arc. The beam caught something, and 1,000 tiny points of light flashed back at them, like a constellation of fallen stars. Alara walked forward, her boots making soft crunching sounds. She knelt and saw what it was. The floor was covered in a carpet of shattered crystal. It was from the chandelier, the magnificent centerpiece she had glimpsed in the photograph. It must have crashed to the floor when the demolition crew collapsed the main house above it, exploding into 1,000,000 glittering pieces. She picked up a single, long prism, its facets still sharp. As she turned it in her flashlight beam, it threw a shower of fractured rainbows across the dusty floor. It was a tiny spark of the room's former life, a reminder of the light and music that had once filled this space. The ballroom was not empty. It was full of ghosts, full of echoes, and they were standing right in the middle of them. The real excavation had only just begun. The 2 days following their descent into the ballroom were a blur of hushed excitement and strategic planning. Alara and Liam knew they were sitting on a discovery of immense historical significance, but it was also a secret that was fragile and vulnerable. They had breached the seal, but the story was still theirs alone. Bringing it into the light required a careful, deliberate approach. To simply announce their find to the town would invite chaos, a flood of curiosity seekers who could inadvertently damage the site before it could be properly documented. They needed allies, professionals who understood the language of preservation and who could lend their discovery the weight of official authentication. Their first and only choice was the State Preservation Society. Alara drafted the email, rewriting it a dozen times. She attached the photo of the blueprint, the image of the sepia-toned party, and the shots they had taken in the darkness of the ballroom, the brass balustrade, the broken marble column, the field of shattered crystal. She kept the tone measured and professional, outlining the evidence step by step, but she couldn't completely suppress the sense of wonder that infused every word. She sent it late at night, her heart pounding as she clicked the button, launching their private secret into the public sphere. The response came faster than she could have ever imagined. At 8 a.m. the next morning, her phone rang. It was Dr. Alistair Finch, the head of architectural history for the Society, his voice a rich baritone buzzing with an energy that was anything but academic. He had seen her email. He was, to put it mildly, astounded. He asked a rapid-fire series of questions, his excitement palpable through the phone line. By the end of the 10-minute call, a plan was in place. He and a small team would drive out the very next day. The arrival of the Preservation Society team felt like a momentous occasion. Two unassuming vans pulled up to the edge of the lot, and out stepped Dr. Finch, a man with a shock of white hair and the bright, enthusiastic eyes of a child on Christmas morning, and three younger colleagues. They were armed not with shovels, but with cameras, archival storage boxes, and delicate brushes. Ilara and Liam led them to the pit, to the broken concrete slab and the dark opening that led down into the past. Dr. Finch peered down the staircase, his flashlight beam illuminating the golden gleam of the brass railing, and let out a low, reverent whistle. "My word," he breathed. "It's exactly as you described." The descent was slow and methodical this time. The team documented every step, photographing the debris on the stairs, the texture of the stone walls, the craftsmanship of the balustrade. When they finally stepped out onto the ballroom floor, a collective hushed awe fell over the group. Powerful battery-operated floodlights were set up, and for the first time, the true scale and state of the ballroom were revealed. The floodlights pushed back the oppressive darkness, illuminating a scene of majestic ruin. The vast, black-and-white marble floor was visible beneath its thick coat of dust. The immense 30-foot ceiling soared above them, a complex web of plasterwork and decorative moldings, remarkably intact save for a few cracks and the gaping hole where the chandelier had once hung. The walls were lined with the faint, ghostly outlines of where ornate tapestries or mirrors had once been. And at the far end of the hall, just as the blueprint had promised, was a wide raised stage, an empty pedestal where an orchestra had once played the foxtrots and waltzes that filled her grandmother's memories. It was a perfect, preserved time capsule of the moment of its own destruction. While the team worked, documenting, measuring, and carefully collecting samples of the debris, Ilara felt a sense of vindication so profound it was almost overwhelming. This was real. It was all real. But her triumph was interrupted by an unexpected arrival. A car had pulled up to the lot, and a familiar figure was walking slowly towards the excavation site. It was Mr. Abernathy. He looked older and more frail in the harsh morning light, his tweed jacket seeming to hang off his stooped shoulders. He carried no authority here. He was just an old man, drawn by the news that must have already begun to filter through the small town's gossip mill. Dr. Finch, recognizing him from a past conference, greeted him cordially, but Abernathy only had eyes for Ilara. He approached her, his face a mask of weary resignation. "So you did it," he said, his voice quiet. "You couldn't leave it alone." There was no anger in his tone now, only a deep, profound sadness. "Why?" Ilara asked, her voice equally quiet. "Why did you try to stop me? What is the secret you were so desperate to protect?" Abernathy looked away from her, his gaze falling on the dark opening to the ballroom. He was silent for a long time. It was Dr. Finch who inadvertently broke the tension. He called out from the pit, his voice echoing with excitement. "Liam, Ilara, we found something remarkable near the stage. A whole section of the wall behind the orchestra platform is false. It seems to be a sealed door, a very large one." He was describing the entrance to the vault. That was the moment the second, more personal plot twist revealed itself. At the mention of a sealed door, Mr. Abernathy flinched as if struck. All the fight went out of him, replaced by a look of pained confession. He finally turned back to Ilara, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "My father was the foreman for the demolition company," he said, the words coming out in a pained rush. It was the biggest contract his small firm had ever landed. The Lockwoods were gone, the house was slated for destruction, but another family in town, rivals of your great-grandfather, they approached my father. He paused, taking a shaky breath. They paid him extra, a lot extra, not just to demolish the house, but to erase this place completely, to make sure it was never found. They wanted the Lockwood legacy not just ended, but buried, forgotten. The story tumbled out of him, a confession held for a lifetime. His father had falsified the demolition permit, claiming there was no basement to avoid the scrutiny that a deeper excavation would bring. He had his crew collapse the main house in such a way that the debris would fill the stairwell, then he personally oversaw the pouring of the concrete seal. It was a secret he had carried to his grave, a secret he had passed on to his son, the future town historian. Arthur Abernathy had spent his entire life as the keeper of a lie, his position at the Historical Society both a penance and a means of standing guard. His warnings to Ilara hadn't been to protect some dark Lockwood scandal. They had been to protect his own family's reputation, to keep his father's crime, a conspiracy of fraudulent demolition, from ever coming to light. The immense weight of his lifelong guilt was palpable. He wasn't a villain. He was just the son of a man who had made a desperate choice in a difficult time, a choice that had ripple effects for 3/4 of a century. The historian hadn't been guarding a treasure, he'd been guarding a crime scene. The authentication by the State Preservation Society acted like a starting gun. Dr. Finch, recognizing the immense public interest and the need to control the narrative, held a press conference right at the edge of the lot 2 days later. The story was an immediate sensation, a perfect human interest tale laced with history, mystery, and the romance of a lost era. It was picked up by local news, then regional affiliates, and within a week it had gone national. The overgrown, forgotten parking lot was suddenly the most famous piece of land in the state. The chain-link fence, once sagging and ignored, was now reinforced and plastered with no trespassing signs, a temporary measure until a more permanent security solution could be arranged. The community, which had for decades driven past this patch of weeds without a second glance, was now utterly captivated by it. A constant stream of cars began to flow past the lot, their drivers slowing down to a crawl, hoping to catch a glimpse of the excavation pit. People would park at the nearby community center and walk over, standing at the fence line in small, reverent groups, pointing and murmuring. They were neighbors who had lived here for 50 years and had never known. They were teenagers who saw it as a real-life adventure story. They were amateur history buffs who came with their own theories and questions. The lot was no longer a place of quiet secrets, it was a stage, and the whole town had become the audience. The air, which had once been thick with the hum of insects, now buzzed with human curiosity. For Alara and Liam, the experience was surreal. They were no longer just a pair of curious grandchildren, they were the central figures in a local legend. Their phones rang constantly with calls from reporters, documentary producers, and distant relatives they hadn't heard from in years. They were hailed as heroes, detectives, saviors of a piece of lost history. Liam, with his engineer's pragmatism, handled the logistical questions with ease, explaining the structural challenges and the plans for safely securing the site. Alara became the storyteller, the keeper of the family lore, repeating the tale of her grandmother's stories, the conflicting documents, and the hidden blueprint. She spoke about Evelyn with a fierce pride, ensuring that her grandmother was seen as the true origin of the discovery, the one whose memory had held the key all along. The most profound part of the community buzz, however, was the arrival of the other Lockwoods. The news story had acted as a clarion call, reaching branches of the family that had scattered across the country over the decades. A great-uncle from California, a second cousin from Chicago, a whole family of third cousins from Florida. They arrived not as claimants to a treasure, but as pilgrims drawn to a part of their shared identity they had never known. They gathered at Alara's grandmother's house, which had become the unofficial headquarters for the rediscovery. They brought with them their own fragments of the family story, faded photographs, half-remembered anecdotes, and letters that had been stored in attics for generations. In a powerful, emotional gathering, they all stood at the fence line of the lot, looking at the place where their family's grandest statement had been hidden. The great-uncle, a man in his late 80s who had been a small boy when the mansion was torn down, wept openly. He remembered playing on the lawns, but he had never known about the ballroom. My father, William's younger brother, he never spoke of it, he said, his voice thick with emotion. There was always a sadness around the loss of the house, a shame almost. Now I understand. They weren't ashamed of being poor. They were grieving this. The community buzz was reassembling their family, piecing together not just the history of a building but the fractured story of the Lockwoods themselves. Amid the public excitement, the story of Arthur Abernathy and his father's role in the cover-up came to light, though Alara and Dr. Finch handled it with immense sensitivity. Abernathy gave a formal statement, a public confession that was printed in the local paper. He resigned from his post at the Historical Society, and instead of being met with scorn, he was met with a surprising wave of community sympathy. His story became a poignant footnote to the larger tale of the ballroom, a story of a man trapped by a father's difficult choice, a testament to how long and complicated the shadows of the past can be. His confession, in a way, liberated him, and the town, seeing his remorse, chose understanding over condemnation. The Preservation Society, meanwhile, worked with an almost feverish intensity. They had successfully cleared the debris from the staircase and had begun the painstaking process of cleaning a section of the ballroom floor. Under their careful hands, a 10 by 10 foot square of the black and white marble was revealed, its polished surface gleaming under the work lights, looking as perfect and brilliant as the day it was laid. They had also begun to carefully examine the sealed door to the vault. It was a massive slab of steel-reinforced concrete, set flush into the wall behind the stage, with no visible hinges or handles. It was a formidable obstacle, its purpose still a complete and tantalizing mystery. The public speculation about the vault's contents ran wild, from hidden fortunes to wartime secrets. The buzz was no longer just about the past, it was about the future, about what other secrets the ballroom had yet to reveal. For Alara, standing amidst the crowd of her newfound relatives, watching the professionals work to reclaim her family's legacy, the feeling was one of overwhelming completion. The secret was out, the community was engaged, and the family was together. The whispers from the past had finally become a public chorus. Weeks turned into months, and the initial frenzy surrounding the discovery slowly settled into a productive, forward-looking hum. The site was now fully secured, the temporary fencing replaced by a more permanent and respectful barrier. The State Preservation Society, in partnership with a newly formed Lockwood Family Foundation headed by Liam and Alara, had taken full stewardship of the project. The raw, muddy pit had been transformed into a professionally managed archaeological site, with a weatherproof canopy erected over the entrance to the stairwell and a sophisticated system of lighting and ventilation installed within the ballroom itself. The space was no longer a dark, forgotten tomb. It was a laboratory of history, alive with the quiet, focused work of restoration. The painstaking process of cleaning continued, revealing more of the ballroom's heartbreaking beauty. Conservators worked inch by inch, removing the thick blanket of dust to unveil the full glory of the marble floor. The effect was breathtaking. The bold geometric pattern stretched across the vast space, its polished surface reflecting the worklights like a dark, placid lake. The walls, once cleaned of their grime, revealed faint traces of hand-painted murals between the spaces where tapestries had hung, delicate flowing scenes of mythical figures and pastoral landscapes. Every new detail uncovered was a victory, another word added to a story that had been silenced for too long. The ballroom was slowly, carefully being allowed to speak again. The great mystery of the vault was finally and gently resolved. After extensive analysis using ground-penetrating radar, the team decided against a destructive entry. Instead, they brought in a specialized engineering firm that drilled a small, keyhole-sized opening, inserting a fiber-optic camera. There was no hidden gold, no wartime secrets, no scandalous treasure. The vault was almost entirely empty. It contained only a series of empty pedestals and a single large fireproof safe. When a master locksmith was brought in to open the safe, all it held was a thick leather-bound ledger. The ledger contained a detailed inventory, with descriptions and photographs of a world-class collection of Renaissance art, paintings, sculptures, and rare manuscripts. The final page was a shipping manifest, dated 1941, showing that the entire collection had been secretly crated and transported to various museums and private collectors, with the proceeds used to establish anonymous endowments for the arts. The truth was more poignant and selfless than any of the wild theories. The ballroom and its vault hadn't been built to hoard wealth, but to protect it and, ultimately, to give it away. William and Alistair Lockwood, facing financial ruin and the onset of a world war, had built their secret hall not for vanity, but as a last act of grand-scale philanthropy. They had sold their most precious treasures to ensure their legacy would not be one of a crumbling mansion, but of a quiet, enduring support for the culture they loved. The secrecy, the erasure from the records, it had all been to prevent their creditors or rivals from interfering before their plan was complete. It recast her great-grandparents not as figures of simple opulence, but as people of incredible foresight, principle, and a deep abiding love for art. Their legacy wasn't buried in the ground, it was alive and well in the museums and galleries they had anonymously supported for decades. For Alara, this final revelation was the most profound discovery of all. It recontextualized everything. The ballroom was not a monument to pride, but a monument to purpose. It was a grand gesture of defiance against the dying of the light. She often went to the site in the evenings, after the conservators had gone home. She would stand on the now pristine landing at the bottom of the great staircase, looking out into the vast, beautifully lit space. The brass balustrade gleamed under the lights, and the marble floor shone with a deep liquid luster. In her mind, she could hear the faint crackling notes of the Benny Goodman records her grandmother had loved. She could almost see the ghosts, not as haunting specters, but as joyful celebrants, their laughter echoing off the walls. She finally understood the smiles in the faded photograph. It was the joy of people who knew they were part of something beautiful and secret, a final magnificent act before the curtain fell. The Lockwood Family Foundation, with the support of the town and the state, had developed a long-term plan. The ballroom would not be a sealed-off museum piece. It would be restored to its full glory, and a small, elegant glass atrium would be built over the site of the original conservatory, serving as a new public entrance. The ballroom would once again be a place for the community, for concerts, for exhibitions, for weddings. It would live again, its purpose renewed. Elara, who had started this journey feeling adrift with a history degree and a craving for connection, had found her life's work. She was no longer just a granddaughter settling an estate. She was a custodian of a legacy, a bridge between a magnificent past and a vibrant future. She reflected on the incredible chain of events, a forgotten box of papers, a suspicious permit, a faded photograph, a hidden blueprint. Each was a small key that had unlocked a progressively larger door, leading her here. Her family's pride, which had been buried under decades of silence and rubble, was now restored, shining more brightly than ever. She looked out across the magnificent, rediscovered wonder, and she made a silent vow to her grandmother, to her great-grandparents, and to the future. She would preserve this place. She would share its story. She would make sure the music never stopped again.